زي ما رحبوا فيكم بالعربي، وانا كان بحب اني احكي بالعربي لولا انه الكتاب اولا بالانجليزي، ثانيا لانه في معنا مجموعه كبيره من اللي بيفهموش اللغه العربيه فمضطرين نحكي اما اذا حدا بعدين بحب يسال سؤال بالعربي او يستفهم شيء بالعربي ما فيش معنى. Actually, to a Jerusalem audience, Samia doesn't need to be introduced, or to a Palestinian audience, or to many of our international friends. But for the sake of those who don't know Samia, let me tell you who she is. Samia Khoury is an active community volunteer who served as national president of the YWCA of Palestine and president of Rawdat al-Zuhur School. She's a founding member of the board of trustees of Birzeit University and Sabil Ecumenical Liberation Theology Center, and serves on the local advisory committee of the Mennonite Central Committee. She has earned recognition from local NGOs and the Citation of Merit Award from the Alumni Association of Southwestern University, from which she graduated with a BBA degree in 1954. Samia lives in Jerusalem and was married to the late Yabous Cultural Centre, who passed away in 2004. I will soon pass over to Samia to tell us about her book, but let me just say a few words about the book. We all know that in the Western media, when they handle our situation, they concentrate on conferences, on summits, on agreements, on framework agreements or disagreements, on the political side, negotiations or non-negotiations. Seldom do they tell our story, the story of our everyday lives. And maybe this is one of the reasons why the world can still tolerate this almost 46-year-old occupation. Because, and I put the blame primarily on ourselves and on our media, because we do not make a special effort to let our voice be heard outside. We sometimes seem to be talking to each other. This is the importance of this book. As I was reading the book, I found myself having to often put it aside and reflect on my own story. In the same events, thinking back, trying to remember where I was, what was going around me, my family, at the same event. So this happens all the time, because actually every one of us has a story inside that is crying to come out. And we need to do that. It's a duty that we have. So the shortcoming is ours and our media's. The subtitle of Samia's book is A Journey of Hope. And indeed it is. Samia will soon take us along this journey. And as she goes along, she takes us across several stations on the way. Stations of pain and suffering. Stations of fear and intimidation. Stations of separation and bereavement. Brief stations of joy and success. Never losing faith. Always with dignity. Always with a sense of humor. But most of all, always seeking the humanity of the oppressor. So, in the end, the most important thing is that it is a story about the triumph of the human spirit. It is a story about the triumph of the Palestinian spirit. So without further ado, I will turn to Samia to lead us along her journey.
Thank you, Cedar. I don't know what to react anyway. Thank you. I would also like to say a few words in Arabic. أعتذر للجمهور الفلسطيني لأنه هذا الكتاب بالإنجليزي. كان ودي أن أكتب بالعربي، لكن القصد منه كان أوجهه للجمهور الغربي، لأنه نحن عارفين كل يوم معاناتنا وعارفين شو عم بيصير، بس الوجه الإنساني والمعاناة اليومية اللي ما بتوصل للخارج كانت هذه كان الهدف منها إني أكتب بالإنجليزي للخارج. كثير من الأصدقاء يقولوا لي يا الله شو حلوة هالريفلكشن اللي كتبتيها، بس يا ريتك تكتبيها بالعربي. بقول له لمين أكتبها بالعربي؟ ما إحنا عارفين، أنا وياك عارفين الوضع يعني. على كل حال. I was just saying why I'm writing in English, exactly what Cedar has said, because to the Western world or to the world outside Palestine, they don't see the human side of the Palestinian. They don't see what we go through every day. They don't see what the occupation has done to every soul, to every person, to every family. Not one person has not been touched. Not one family has not been affected. And thus I write in English, so that I express on behalf of my people what is going on. So this book is actually based on many reflections that I had started to write. Just because things were happening, I get it out of my system, I think. Because sometimes my sister tells me, why do you keep writing? Everybody knows what's happening. I said, I get it out of my system to get it into somebody else's system. So I start the book with a new reality overnight, with the 67 events, and how things changed overnight for us. We were at a wedding the day before, the wedding of my cousin, the wedding of my sister-in-law, and they are with us here. And the next day, we were under occupation. We were not ready, neither for war, nor were we ready for the occupation. It was just too much. So life turned upside down for us. And I talk about the bittersweet experience of seeing our homes before 1948, seeing all Palestine that we were deprived of since 48. It was such a joy to see it, but at the same time, what an experience to see it because of the occupation and not because of liberation or the right of return. It was a short period that I call a brief honeymoon after the occupation, until the nightmare actually started. After we all saw our homes and visits and went to the seashore of Jaffa, where I was born, and various towns where we lived and so on, it became consistent. Every family was touched at the time. So I share stories, some of them personal stories, deportation of my brother, imprisonment of my son, assassination of my cousin, and stories of other people who suffered also. The agonizing process of the family reunification. Both my children married spouses from outside Jerusalem. We used to think of the word mixed marriage, a marriage between a couple of different faiths. But under the occupation, all terminology gets lopsided. Doesn't mean the same thing. So a mixed marriage these days under occupation, it means if one spouse is from the West Bank and the other is from Jerusalem. So you have to go through a process of family reunification, etc., etc. Well, we've been through that process, and it's still just as difficult as the peace process. My daughter's been married since 84, and my son since 98, and they are both without unification yet. Actually, it is probably easier to get a couple from different faiths married. They can cope with that difficulty. It's much easier than having to be able to live in Jerusalem if they are not from Jerusalem. I write about the first Intifada. The first Intifada and the sense of solidarity amongst the people during that time, contrasted to the disappointment, the hopelessness that we feel these days, unfortunately, because of the Palestinian infighting and the establishment of two separate entities in the West Bank and Gaza after the elections of 2006. I have comments in the book about how this happened and why it should not have happened, etc., etc. And then I go to the Oslo Accords. And despite the controversy, and many people were for it, many against it, and I feel that it was not thoroughly done. And I use a quotation from Lord Chesterfield to his son. Apropos de say, he says, anything done and not done well is better than not done at all. When you do things, or you write things, or you say things, you do them properly and completely and fully. Otherwise, it's better not done at all. And this is how I feel about Oslo. It was not done fully, or properly, or completely. We left all the core issues until the end of 5 years. The 5 years have passed 5 and 10, how many years since then? And we are where we are. Yet the euphoria of peace, you could not overlook that. Seeing the children throwing roses on the tanks instead of stones, that was a sight. The excitement to see the muqata'a empty, where our children used to be in prison. We went and visited, everybody visited the cells that they were held in. There was something, and this gave us hope that maybe there is going to be a change. And that's why the disappointment has become much worse afterwards, when we realized that this is just simply a process and a process. And I talk about the brutality of these days when they used to stop the children on the roads, strip them at night, and I describe this, and I use Yafa Yarkoni, who is an Israeli singer. She passed away not long ago, I think a year or two ago, and she said, I cannot believe what is happening. This reminds me of what the Nazis used to do to us. Yafa Yarkoni is not just any Israeli. She used to sing behind the soldiers in the army since '48. She's the one who sang Israel, Jerusalem the Golden after '67. Yet she could not get away with what she said. She was shunned. The concert she was going to have to honor her was cancelled. Israel cannot cope with voices of dissent. You have to be in line with the policy. And that's what really broke her heart, because the way she was treated, despite all what she has contributed, and there are so many others like her. I quote many Israelis in this. And this is one thing that I think also gives us a little bit of hope, as long as there are people who are honest enough to say the truth Because what scares Israel mostly is the truth. You cannot expose the truth. Because they've been living over myths, one myth after the other. And that is what makes it difficult for them to hear any voice that is not in accordance to what they would like, their narrative. Of course, I have almost a whole chapter about our everyday life, with my family, with my children, and so on. And how a normal life was the first victim of the occupation. I say normal life, the first victim, because under occupation, anything can happen. Anything is absurd. And you never know. I always used to say, you get up with the right foot, you don't know if the left foot is going to follow it even. It's just so unpredictable. You go out, you think you are on your way, and then around the corner, you are faced with a big surprise. We're always in for surprises. And so I write a lot about these incidents. The worry about the children, grandchildren going. I never dreamt I would bring up 2 generations under occupation. But that's part of it. Part of the feeling that comes up. And to me, when we had Jewish neighbors in Safed, I knew the Jew as a person, as a human being. Our children and grandchildren never encountered the Jewish community except as Israeli soldiers. And that makes a lot of difference. The unpredictability, when we had the curfews, even funerals and weddings could not be planned ahead of time. Somebody dies and they sit there until the curfew is lifted. No announcements, anything. They just take an opportunity. I remember talking about a funeral in Beit Jala. We were at a memorial service in Beit Jala in the morning, and soon after we left, they started decorating the church. In 2 hours, they had to get in the wedding after the funeral, after the memorial service. They had to get a wedding. And just in between curfew hours. And that makes life very, very, very difficult. And you never know what goes in the minds of the children and the young people who are being exposed to all this every day. We watch and watch. And so many times, what the children tell me, their experiences, are the ones that inspire me to write certain things. And of course, the occupation itself inspires you. I remember when the Witness magazine asked me to write a monthly article for them, and I said, okay. And then I turned around and I looked at Cedar and I said, why do I commit myself? Where am I going to get material for an article every month? And she said, don't worry, the occupation will always inspire you. And this book is an inspiration from the occupation, I assure you. Anyway, I have a whole chapter about the futile negotiations, whether direct, indirect, proximity, exploratory. We have a long list of words that goes along with them, and the many concessions that we have to make in the process. And I talk about the onslaught on Jerusalem, the ongoing onslaught on Jerusalem, and how we miss Faisal Husseini and the Orient House, and how the community in Jerusalem felt abandoned after his death. I write about the shift to nonviolence, resistant. And although I emphasize also that during the first Intifada, Beit Sahur took a fantastic initiative when they had civil disobedience. But the reaction of the Israeli military to that disobedience, to that civil disobedience, was so harsh that it was not picked up by the other towns around it. It was so difficult, what they were doing. I mean, the brutality that they dealt with the people, the stores, they mixed the food, they tortured the people, they attacked them in every way, that they were not able to continue in that line. And I think if this was picked up really, it would have been a complete change of history, maybe, in our area, of our resistance. But the BDS now, boycott, divestment, sanctions, is picking up. This is something that we keep encouraging all our friends to endorse and to encourage, because I think this is the only way out now with all what's happening. And we are encouraging, for instance, we at Sabil, we work with lots of churches, and we encourage them to raise a prophetic voice and to have courage to speak up. Because usually, a lot of these churches are also intimidated. They are intimidated by Jews and by the movement of interfaith. And under the cover of interfaith, you can talk about anything, but when it comes to Israel, it's taboo. So why have the interfaith? I mean, you're not going to change anybody's dogma. The interfaith is meant so that you can use the best in each faith to work for the welfare of the whole world, for human rights and for justice and peace. And the last chapter of my book is about music. All through those years, we could not have sustained our faith in our just cause without cultural events. Music, art, dancing, it kept us going. In fact, Yabous, this cultural center, was founded in Jerusalem, especially for this purpose, to lift the spirits of the people. It keeps us going. And when you see young children carrying their musical instruments, walking in Zahra Street, going to the conservatory, it lifts your spirit and boosts your morale. And you send a message also to the whole world that we are ordinary people that like to enjoy life. One time a person told me, if you didn't have this Palestine-Israel conflict, what would you be talking about? I said, I yearn to talk about music and art and the nature and many other things, I said, but you leave me no room when you come here asking the questions. I have to answer you and talk about this only. So it really is a pleasure. And many of you maybe have attended Fawanis. I remember the first of its type musical with around 45, 40, or maybe around 60 children from all the schools of the area. It was a musical based on the story by Ghassan Kanafani, The Little Lantern, Qandil al-Saghir. It was fantastic, the achievement of these children, what they did. And now the conservatory has more than one orchestra. But the highlight was the debut of the Palestine National Orchestra in January 2011, under the slogan, today an orchestra and tomorrow a state. Inshallah.
As we go along, I'm going to ask Samia to read some passages from her book that caught my attention about certain events. But let me first say something about a reflection that I had when I read the title of the first chapter. It says, A New Reality Overnight. Don't we have a new reality every day? Sometimes more than one in one same day. Now, when I read this, I remembered this is about 1967, A New Reality Overnight. And as I told you, I put the book down and I tried to remember where I was and what happened in 1967. I was with my family, with my late husband Khalil, who was a pastor of the Anglican Church in Haifa. We were in Haifa and we were listening to the news, very worried. And every news station, every broadcast told us a different thing. Egypt was saying something, and Jordan was saying something else, and Israel was saying something else. I remember I switched to the Voice of Israel to see, just to try and find out what was going on. And it said, I can't forget that. It said, "This is the voice of Israel calling from Ramallah." And I almost collapsed. I haven't yet met anybody who agrees with me, who has heard the same thing. Maybe people were not, it was in English, they broadcast in English, Arabic, French, and Russian, and other languages. I switched to the English broadcast, and it said, "This is the voice of Israel broadcasting from Ramallah," or calling from Ramallah. And I almost fainted. And it dawned on me, it was over. So that was for me the new reality overnight. But then every day, we have a new reality overnight. As Samia says, you have to have a new geography lesson every day because the roads change, the checkpoints move, and the borders change, and everything changes. So Samia, I'm going to, when you talk about crossing the bridge into Amman, and you did that very, very often, would you please read us something about that? There are stories that you wrote about that are really worth reading.
The first meeting of the Board of Trustees.
Yes, that's
nice.
yes. As the YWCA at the time was part of the YWCA of Jordan, until later on we turned to become independent YWCA of Palestine. I always say the YWCA is avant-garde in many issues. And we were recognized as Palestine, YWCA of Palestine, before any United Nations has recognized anything about Palestine. Anyway, so in one of those experiences, I was on my way to Amman. I had the most memorable experience I had at the bridge was one morning when some members of the Board of Trustees of Birzeit University and I were on our way to Amman to meet with Hannah. Hannah, my brother, was president and he was deported at the time, so we were going to meet with him there to discuss the bylaws of the university, among other issues. As the secretary of the board at that time, I had a folder with all the necessary papers. It was not the norm to search people as they were leaving the Israeli side of the bridge. However, the censor officer asked to have a look at my folder. I was waiting in line near Gabi Baranki, whose face and height were very familiar to the Israeli security due to the endless confrontations with Israeli forces at the university. A few days before our crossing, the Israeli army had invaded the men's dorm and pulled students out of their beds and showers. A number of students were injured in that horrible and brutal confrontation. The Public Relations Office at the university issued a publication documenting the incident with photos, and I happened to be carrying 3 copies of those pamphlets along with other university papers. My sister Rima was already waiting for me outside the hall when she saw the officer opening the folder. She immediately spotted the publications, and the stern look she gave me scared me more than the interrogation of the officer, who had already confiscated the whole folder. Of course, I could also read her lips as she bowed. Which means jackass. On his no, I must say that on his next trip, actually, Gabby was asked whether he was carrying any papers or whether he had somebody else carrying them. So they did connect me with the university, but they connected me with Gabby.
What year was that?
74.
70.
3, 4, 5.
1 year, 70. 75.
As you notice, Samia's style of writing is easy and flowing and with a sense of humor, so reading the book is very, very pleasant. Samia, another incident, Samia's son, Suhail, is not with us today. He's taking a course in London. But I was very much affected by the story of how Suhail was imprisoned, kidnapped, Samia says in her book, and about his release. Now, I also want to mention that Samia says she considers herself one of the blessed ones, one of the blessed families, because her experiences are not as bad as other people are going through. But she did have a son who was imprisoned, went to prison. She did have a cousin who was killed, who was murdered, assassinated in Beirut. And still, Samia, in her hopeful spirit, considers herself one of the lucky ones. Samia, this story about Suhail's release, if not about his imprisonment, could you please read it to us? Do you have your pages?
Yeah. Like everybody else was Suhail during the Intifada. I think in every family during the Intifada had somebody in jail anyway. So Suhail ironically went to jail for, just to give you a background, for music, for making music. Now he's the he's the director of the Edward Said National Conservatory. That didn't deter him from music, I mean, after the imprisonment. In fact, it assured him that that's what he wants to continue doing. Anyway, the day Suhail was to be released was Thursday, December 22nd, 1988. I had contacted the lawyer twice before the day to be sure everything was proceeding according to schedule. After the long drive of almost 3 hours to Atlit prison, which is near Haifa in northern Israel, we were told his release would be the next day. I almost flipped out at the reason they gave for the delay. Indeed, it was quite a paradox. Because the prison authorities thought he was Muslim, they had intended to release him on Thursday to be with his family on Friday, the Muslim holiday. But since they had found out that he was Christian, he would now be released on Friday so that as to be with his family on Sunday, the Christian holiday. Saturday is the Jewish holiday, and they do not release anybody on that day. How kind of them to take his religious holiday into consideration after he had missed so many Sundays already. What a difference would have made one day for the jail authority is beyond me. At that moment, I actually wished I were an atheist, so that nobody could abuse our faith in such a ridiculous manner. The prison authorities, however, released somebody who was not expected to be released. So we did not come home without somebody, a passenger. We did think, where was he? There was a young boy, yes, here I continue. We did not, however, come back empty-handed. We found a young man at the gate who had been released without prior notice. There he was, standing at the gate, looking completely lost, as there was nobody there to pick him up. So we took him. At least one family on the Mount of Olives was happily surprised on that day.
That's nice.
So the happy ending. I wanted to say something about the Intifada. You did speak about the solidarity.
Because it's connected.
Okay.
Those years of the Intifada brought so much suffering upon so many families. But the spirit of solidarity and struggle united us as one community. some of you might have heard this story because it kept going round. But I recall the case of a young boy at the Kalandia refugee camp who was picked up by the Israeli soldiers. Immediately, around 10 women barged in to save him, each claiming he was her son. The soldier was dumbfounded. He exclaimed he had heard of 10 fathers claiming the same son, but 10 mothers? That was something new.
Yeah. You know, some incidents can hardly be believed. I jotted down here an incident about men who, during the olive harvest, during the pressing of the olives, and I have here page 84. It's about the oil incident, I call it. Could you please read that?
Yeah. As if all the raids and shootings were not enough, the Israeli soldiers at the checkpoint were continuously conniving more innovative means to harass the people whose livelihoods depended on the olive harvest. At the village of Burim, also in the Nablus area, a villager who was hauling 30 20-liter cans of olive oil was stopped at a checkpoint that was manned by settlers along the side of soldiers. He was asked to curse Prophet Muhammad so as to be allowed to pass through. When he refused, they started pouring out his oil, one can after the other. Because he insisted on not complying with their request, he eventually left the checkpoint without his oil. The next morning, he found 25 cans of olive oil at his doorstep. That was the spirit of the solidarity at that time.
The first intifada. That was the first intifada. Yeah. Again, there's the incident, Samia, about the closure of your alley. The one that you were complaining, they put this address. This.
Finally, we have an address.
Yes.
This must stop.
Yeah. So this was open at one time, and then tell us what happened when they were closing the alley.
We woke up one morning to the sounds of digging in our street. Rushing out to see what was happening, we found that the military had given instructions to close the road that led to the main entrance of our house. As usual, we were informed that the closure was necessary for security reasons. A gimmick Israel has long used to get away with all its legal actions and violations of the rights of Palestinians. I was so furious at the closure that when one of the workers, who unfortunately was Palestinian, asked for a drink of water, I snapped at him and told him, "Go get a drink from your masters who were paying you to do the job." After I walked into the house, I could not believe that this was me who was refusing a drink of water to anybody. Still shaking with anger about the whole incident, I opened the door to a visitor, my Aunt Victoria, who was a social worker living in Nablus at the time. "Is it true you refused a drink of water to the worker?" The man had apparently asked her to intervene. "Yes," I said. "What happened to you?" she began. "What happened to all the values that you were brought up with as a human being? What about our Palestinian hospitality?" "All gone," I snapped back. "I'm so angry at the military occupation that I took it out on this poor laborer." We both looked at each other and started laughing. And I went and fetched a glass of water and took it to the poor man.
Those of sorry.
I want to connect this with what a difference, I say, between my reaction there and my response to the day that Joseph Ben Eliezer spoke in Nazareth at the Sabir 7th International Conference. Joseph Ben Eliezer, to give you a background, had served in the Israeli army. And he tells us his story. He served in the Israeli army, and now he left Israel and he left his faith. So he came to attend this conference, which was, the name of the conference was Nakba, Memory, Reality, and Beyond. And he came to give a testimony on that day. So physically, a short, small man, Joseph ben Eliezer, stood tall as he asked for forgiveness from the Palestinians. The occasion was the conference on the Nakba, Memory, Reality, and Beyond, which took place in Nazareth and Jerusalem in November 2008. Eliezer shared with the participants his testimony of being an Israeli soldier in 1948. He described taking part in the expulsion of the Palestinian population from Lidda and robbing them of their money and personal possession. Joseph could not live with the reality of that day in July 1948. He realized that what he had done to the Palestinians was what the Nazis had done to his people and to his family before he immigrated from Germany to Palestine after the Holocaust. He did not find a listening ear in the newly established state of Israel. The inhumanity of that war, which a Jew he had believed was a war of liberation and independence, haunted him until he eventually left the country and settled in England. I wonder how many Israelis would have the courage and the magnanimity of Joseph to admit that they have done the Palestinians wrong, let alone to ask for forgiveness. Although his testimony was mostly in front of an international audience, there were a number of Palestinians from Jerusalem and Nazareth who heard him loud and clear. I was so moved that I stood up and recognized his courage, thanking him for his testimony and assuring him that we do forgive him.
You have a picture of
Yeah, there's a picture of me and him.
There are a few other passages that I would love to ask Samia to read, but before that, I'm looking at the time. Maybe we'll open the floor for some questions, and if there is time afterwards, I don't know how much time we have, we can continue because there's a lot more that I would love to ask.
Well, they can always read them in the book.
Yeah, I know. They cannot always hear them read by the author. This is what but let's open the floor now for a few questions, Arabic or English, it doesn't matter, and see what how the time goes. بدكم كمان قراءة، سامع حدا بيقول بدكم كمان قراءة.
يعني هو ليس سؤال وإنما فقط
تعليق.
حتى مش تعليق. لا يمكنني أن أعلق على شيء لم أقرأه حتى الآن. فقط كلمة شكر. أظن أن كل الموجودين الآن في هذه القاعة يشاطرونني هذا الرأي أننا يجب أن نشكر الأخت سامية على هذا الجهد مع التمنيات بأن تتم ترجمة هذا الكتاب أيضا إلى اللغة العربية. صحيح أننا نحن نعلم ما حدث ونحن نعلم القضية الفلسطينية وعدالة القضية الفلسطينية، ولكن يجب أيضا أن نخاطب الأجيال الطالعة لكي لا تنسى. في عندنا نسيان، في ناس عندها البي 12 ناقص، في ناس فقدت البوصلة وبوصلتها اليوم ليست فلسطين والقدس وإنما شيء آخر. وبالتالي أنا أعتقد أننا يجب أن نخاطب شبابنا أبناء شعبنا الفلسطيني الذين هم معرضون أيضا للضياع إذا لم نخاطبهم كما يجب. وبالتالي أنا أعتقد بأنه يجب أن يترجم هذا الكتاب إلى اللغة العربية. شبابنا بحاجة إلى تجربة الأخت سامية كما غيرها أيضا من التجارب لكي يرسخوا انتماءهم وهويتهم العربية الفلسطينية. شكرا.
Bishop Atala just said that he would like to ask Samia to translate the book into Arabic. And although we Arabic speakers know all those incidents and we've gone through them, it is important for posterity to record these incidents and for the sake of our younger generation. Speaking about the younger generation, all those who are under 46 amongst us know nothing but occupation. I mean, sometimes the world forgets how long this occupation has been going on. You know, generations have passed away and generations were born, and this occupation is still grinding on. You know, sometimes our hopes are raised and then they are dashed, and the occupation goes on and on. So I think I agree with Bishop Hanna that for the sake of the new generations, we need to record these incidents and to reflect on them in the Arabic language. Are there any other questions?
Yes.
Yes, please.
The evacuation of Nabi Yaqub camp, you mentioned it in chapter 1. Has it any relation with the evacuation of Hajj al-Yahud and opening the refugee camp in Hafat? معناتها 6 months before the war and a few months the evacuation of camp of Nabi Yaqub camp in Jerusalem. That's something to show.
It is ironic actually, because the day before 67, the one day before 67, when we went to the Galilee and to prepare for the wedding, it was full of soldiers. It was full of soldiers, and they said, "What are you coming for?" We said, "We have a wedding." They said, just don't forget us with the Swiss. You know, people here.
Jordanian soldiers.
The Jordanian soldiers. And the next day, when we went to the Galilee, there isn't one single soldier on the mount. And the camp near us, my father called me in the morning and said, "Come to Birzeit, it's safer because there's a military camp near us, a Jordanian military camp near us." And it turned out my husband stayed at home, and we discovered that the camp was evacuated before even the war started. There were only 2 soldiers there, and the army thought, the Israeli planes thought that there was a whole battalion there, and they kept roaming and bombing from their planes. All what we got damaged is our garden. And then, I mean, it's a mystery. And at the same time, King Hussein on the radio, as Cedar said, we were here, he was saying, "Hold on, we're there, we're coming, you know, we're saving you." Hold on. They didn't have even...
Jamal Abdel Nasser was saying that the Egyptian aircraft is bombing Haifa. I was in Haifa, and the British consul used the same shelter that we use, because the British consulate was across the road from us, and every time the siren went off, he would come running with his briefcase, and the only thing I wanted to do is just snatch it and see what was in it. But we were looking outside, you know, and there was smoke from a haystack, you know, some hay got fired, and they were saying that the Egyptian aircraft bombed the refinery in Haifa. So that's when I switched on to Radio Israel and I heard the bad news. But the triumphalism in that broadcast, you know, it got to me. It really got to me. In such a triumphant, arrogant voice, the voice of Israel calling from Ramallah. Are there any other questions? Or comments? Because if not...
Can I comment?
Yes.
In Arabic.
مش إشي طويل. قديش معنا وقت؟
شكرا كثير على هالسرد الرائع لعذابنا اللي احنا تعذبناه من سنة 48. وأنا بتمنى إنه الكتاب يترجم، لأنه بالفعل راح يفرجي بقية الناس اللي ما عاشوا هذا العذاب شو صار معنا. في بعض العرب مش عارفين هذا الشيء، ولكن كثار من شبابنا عمالين بعيشوه لليوم وبكره وعم يتعذبوا في كل ساعة. إحنا اللي أخذنا الضربة الأولى وانتوا أخذتوا الضربة الثانية، وبديوا يكذبوا لنا بالأول العرب، وصاروا الحمد لله اليهود هلا يكذبوا. الكذب انتشر من أمريكا لوين ما كان. كل قضيتنا عمالة تتعذب من الكذب، وبتأمل إنه يجي يوم اللي الحق يبين. شكرا كثير لكتابك، وبتأمل إنه يترجم. أنا مستعدة أترجمه إذا ممكن.
ما أعرف الناس على حيفا.
سعاد قدمان من حيفا. I'm here since 30 years. You are much longer, you were born here. I saw the first intifada, the second intifada, my children grew up, whatever. And at the beginning when I came and got married, I had a lot of hope for freedom and the Oslo, and my children were waving flags with the Palestinian camps, etc., etc. Over the last 30 years I saw Jerusalem disappearing, especially this year. It's more open, you can see it, how the neighborhoods suddenly disappear when settlers move in your neighborhood. How on earth do you keep up your hope? I mean, that you will get the Palestinian state. How? I mean, I'm losing it by seeing it only since 30 years. You are doing it since forever.
65.
Yeah.
65 years, okay. How do you keep it up? The hope.
Tell us your name, please.
My name is Barbara Ahmad.
Barbara Ahmed.
You know, because our cause is a just cause, you don't lose hope. And because there are people who are willing to stick their necks out yet and stand with us, you don't lose hope. Otherwise, I mean, our mere existence will be meaningless if we lose hope. It's the only thing we can hold on to. I know it's very difficult, and many people ask me this question.
This is the only thing that's holding us. Hope.
Yeah, exactly. And you have to, otherwise anything you do becomes meaningless. I mean, when you open a school for children, when you teach music and so on, if you don't have hope for this young generation, why would you be doing all this? It means nothing. That's why it's very important to maintain our hope. And our sense of humor keeps us going.
It does, and our spirit. You know, one of the most difficult things for us mothers and grandmothers and parents in general is how to explain to children what's going on, and how to keep our children human, and how to keep them sane. I've gone through all this, and Samia speaks about such incidents in her book. One of them caught my attention is at the birthday of Sama, the 4-year-old granddaughter of Samia's sister, and the questions that those children are, and how do you answer them? Sometimes we pretend that things are normal, and we try to bring them up in normal ways. It doesn't always work. So please, Samia, could you read just the questions that those children ask?
معلش في هنا كان سؤال في حدا بده
طيب هلا بنرجع بس تقرا هاي بنرجع اوكي بنرجع. لا يعني ما فيش
وين
شيء.
هذا السنة؟
سما ثانية أقول لك أنا بقول لك وين سما 105. 105.
With the closures between Jerusalem and Ramallah, Sama was miserable because she was deprived of her teta. Teta is the grandma in Arabic. She could not understand why she could not go to see her, or why teta could not come over for her birthday. The grandmother is in the West Bank also. Not only that there is curfew, but there is. The area is closed, her mother said. Who closed it? Sama wanted to know. It's simply closed, her mother answered, thinking that was the end of the story and that there was no need to expand on the issue of soldiers and occupation to a 4-year-old. But when Sama insisted on knowing who closed that road, her mother gave in and explained that it was the soldiers and that there was no way for anybody to go through. Little Sama grasped all that because she already sensed that anything to do with soldiers must be very serious. After a long silence, she came to her mother and said, "You know, I think I'll go buy a gun to get rid of those soldiers." Wow.
Thank you, Samia, you and Eva. I mean, you're such a delight and such a treasure for all of us. And I just wanted to know what was the process of having prepared material for the book. Most of us, I think, we don't write enough. I mean, there are so many stories out there, And for posterity, we need to document that, but I don't think most of us do it. So just tell us a little bit, how did you do it? So that you encourage us maybe to do the same.
Actually, I started, as I said at the beginning, I started writing reflections. And then, way back, yes. Especially I think after the father, when we started having computers, I always write. I mean, I've always, as a young girl, I knew how to type and I write and type and so on. But when the computers, we got on the email, I started sending these reflections out. And the encouragement that I got, the responses from the people I wrote to, that say, this is exactly what we want to hear. I mean, these personal stories that touched people. And then I must give credit to friends of mine who are sitting in the audience, Agharni and Ali Habash. Every time I wrote something that said, you should publish these, you know. And finally, I got myself to collect. Actually, I didn't publish them as collections, but I had to mix them up. I mean, I had to make it into a narrative. But the material, I had the material. I had already written about it. And thanks to Assis Naim, who also wrote the introduction to this, and the liberation theology that I was exposed to during these years helped a lot in seeing things also and connecting them. Like I always talk about the persistent widow from the New Testament. This is a widow who kept taking her case to the judge, who was a very, very bad and cruel judge. And he would say, this woman is bothering me. Eventually, I mean. This woman is bothering me. I'm finally going to give her justice so that she will not bother me anymore. And I always felt, I related this, that maybe we as Palestinians, we have not bothered the world conscience enough. We have not.
One day, Samia was sitting at her computer, looking through her files, and she came across a file that said Tony Blair. And she opened the file and found it empty. So she said, delete. And then a sentence flashed on the screen that said, cannot delete Tony Blair. Samia writes about that incident. Now, yeah. I'm not going to let you leave. I'm not going to let you leave. You know, actually, there's one more paragraph in mind if there is time, but I'm not going to let you leave without telling you what my favorite passage is and the most hopeful in the whole book. Listen to this. Samia says, the latest story that one of my grandchildren brought home the other day is that the Palestinians are guaranteed to go straight to heaven. Do you know why? Because by now, they know all the bypass roads. Talking about children, I don't know whether to read this. I have just one passage that I really would like you to read. If the audience will permit, and if time permits. Now, this is the story that happened to a member of my family. And my friendship with Samia almost cost me the life of my daughter. So Samia, if you would read that, and I'll tell you what page it is, page 187. Could you please read it? Me? No, I want you to read it. 187. And I'll scan it.
Which page?
187 and 88. بس احكي بالاول ايش هي ايش الباك جراوند هي تاخذيها ايه
invitation.
بس ما قلتيش ايش
طيب. This was I asked Cedar to deliver. She was living in Ramallah at the time, and we were invited to Hanan Ashrawi's daughter's wedding. And we couldn't go. I mean, it was hopeless. And I told Cedar, can you carry? Didn't want her to bother carry something. I took a small souvenir from the pottery shop, a little vase like this, and wrapped it and gave it to her. She said, I'll take it. When the curfew is lifted, we'll...
Take it to whom? You didn't tell us that.
To take it to Hanan Ashrawi.
What did you didn't tell us? That Hanan Ashrawi's daughter was getting married. I'm sorry.
It's time we end the session.
Yes.
Anyways, so I read that because the checkpoints and borders we could not go, I did manage to send them the gift with my friend Cedar, who happened to be in Jerusalem and who lives in the same neighborhood in Ramallah. Little did I know that the vase I chose as a symbolic gift from the Palestinian pottery factory in Jerusalem was almost going to cost Amal, Cedar's daughter, her life. Amal had volunteered to deliver the gift once the curfew was lifted. Package in hand, she headed towards the Ashrawi residence. To her great surprise, there was a massive Israeli army tank blocking the Ashrawi residential entrance. She stepped off the pavement and walked towards the tank, intending to go around it into the house. To her horror, the tank gun swung around and pointed its gaping mouth at her. Apparently, she looked suspicious with her mysterious package. She stood in the middle of the road, frozen with terror, searching for a human face to appear from this monster, anyone with whom she could communicate. But the tank was simply a faceless, terrorizing object. Out of nowhere, a car honked, which made Amal jump out of her wits. It was luckily the Ashrawis coming home. She handed them the gift and ran back home.
Okay, Samia, thank you. Thank you. I hope you will enjoy the book as much as I did. And, when I introduced Samia, I did not mention that she's my dear friend, a gracious person, somebody who is dependable, always there for you, always wise, always giving you good advice. And, Samia always reminds me of Kipling's verse that says, she can talk with crowds and keep her virtue, or walk with kings, nor lose the common touch. This is Samia. Thank you very much.
Very much again, Cedar, and thank you very much, Samia. What is left to me is to thank you, our brilliant audience tonight. One thing I would like to say at the end is we as book promoters and booksellers, we are always keen for Palestinian writers to write and to promote their book, because there is no one who can write about the Palestinian cause more than the Palestinians. Thank you very much and have a lovely evening. The book is for sale outside. Samia is here to sign the book. There is some drinks and pastries on the door. Enjoy your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.